The beautiful infection. Nietzsche's warning about art that corrupts. When art gets sick, what if the most beautiful thing you've ever heard was a lie? What if music, the kind that gives you goosebumps and makes your heart tremble, was actually a seductive poison slowly unraveling your soul? That's exactly what one of history's most ferocious philosophers came to believe. Friedrich Nietzsche, once the loudest voice praising the composer Richard Wagner, would later accuse him of infecting the soul of Europe. This wasn't just betrayal, it was revelation. Nietzsche's admiration wasn't casual. Wagner was his idol, a prophet of myth and greatness. But then, the veil slipped. The beauty didn't disappear. It just revealed something horrifying behind it. He saw that Wagner's operas weren't lifting the human spirit. They were hypnotizing it. Not calling us to rise, but inviting us to sink into sentiment, into weakness, into a church of emotions dressed in melody and myth. Wagner's music, he said, had become the morphine of a dying civilization. And here's the twist. Nietzsche believed this wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a warning, because art, when corrupted, doesn't just entertain, it infects. And in a world drowning in curated beauty, dopamine beats, and emotional manipulation, that warning echoes louder than ever. This isn't a documentary, this is a diagnosis. A deep dive into how one man's transformation from worshiper to whistleblower reveals the truth behind some of today's most celebrated art. If you think beauty always saves, you're not ready for what Nietzsche found behind the curtain. Chapter 1. The Son Who Worshipped a False God. There was a time when Friedrich Nietzsche would have walked through fire for Richard Wagner. Imagine a young philosopher, fragile in health but burning with intellect, discovering in Wagner's music what felt like the divine made audible. The thunder of myth, the echo of ancient gods, the promise of a reborn German soul, it was all there, crashing through every operatic note. Nietzsche didn't just love Wagner, he believed in him. Wagner was more than a composer. He was a redeemer, a musical messiah offering an escape from the sickening modern world. For Nietzsche, who raged against the mediocrity of mass morality and herd instincts, Wagner's art was a sword against cultural rot. But devotion is a dangerous drug, and behind every altar is a shadow waiting to grow. As Nietzsche's fame grew and his philosophical mind sharpened, so did the cracks in his faith. At first, they were whispers, a note that felt too indulgent, a scene that glorified too much suffering, a melody that soothed rather than stirred. But over time, those whispers became screams. The God he worshipped wasn't leading him to strength, he was lulling him into softness. He was seducing with sweetness, not sharpening with truth. Nietzsche's epiphany didn't arrive in a single flash of lightning. It was death by 1,000 crescendos. He began to see the rot wrapped in roses, the Christ-like figures in Wagner's operas, glorified not for rising, but for falling. Saviors who wept more than they conquered, martyrs in melody. And then it hit him like a thunderclap. This wasn't the art of greatness, it was the art of surrender. This wasn't the music of the gods, it was the music of a world already dying and looking for lullabies. You can picture him alone in his study, pale hands gripping a book of scores, realizing the melodies he once played with awe were now unbearable. And yet, he didn't burn them, he dissected them. Like a betrayed son studying the poison that once tasted like love, Nietzsche wrote, "The case of Wagner, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Because once you see infection, you cannot unsee it." He wanted to warn others, not just about a man, but about a force. Have you ever adored something, only to one day see it clearly and feel sick to your stomach? A film, a lover, a belief that once lit your world now feels manipulative? That was Nietzsche's Wagner. The god he followed had a mask, and underneath was not fire, but fog. But this is just the beginning, because once Nietzsche exposed the betrayal, he had to name the disease. And what he discovered wasn't confined to music. It was cultural, it was spiritual, it was the epidemic of our age, disguised as art. Chapter 2. The Veil That Sings. What makes a lie so powerful is not its boldness, but its beauty. Nietzsche didn't fear Wagner because his music was ugly. He feared it because it was gorgeous, lush, emotional, hypnotic. It wrapped the listener in a golden fog, filling their heart while quietly emptying their soul. And that's what made it dangerous. Because when art makes you feel everything, you stop questioning anything. To Nietzsche, Wagner's art was no longer about truth, it was theater. But not the kind that reveals the raw pulse of existence. This was theater that blurred pain into pleasure, turning emotional collapse into spiritual climax. It didn't challenge the audience, it coddled them. The veil that sang was a curtain of sentiment, a shield against reality, and the more we cheered, the deeper we sank. This wasn't just about Wagner anymore. Nietzsche began to see a pattern, art that overstimulates to distract, that seduces to sedate. It's not a performance, it's a spell. And today, that spell hasn't died. It's grown louder. Our world is filled with veils that sing, auto-tuned heartache, cinematic trauma porn, influencers preaching self-love while drowning in filters. The more beautiful the presentation, the more we assume it must be truth. But Nietzsche would ask, what's behind the curtain? Imagine walking into an opera house, lights dimmed, music swelling. The lead character is dying, but we cheer because he's doing it beautifully. This is the sickness Nietzsche saw. Tragedy wrapped in applause. A culture clapping for collapse because it comes with strings and stage lights. He saw the future in that room. He saw us, listening, weeping, and never waking up. But here's the horror. Beauty disarms you. It lowers your guard. It invites you in, so you forget you're being led. That's why Nietzsche didn't just critique Wagner's art. He feared it, because it bypassed the mind and went straight for the nerves. It bypassed strength and fed suffering. It was aesthetic anesthesia. And have you ever felt that too? Have you ever been moved to tears by something that, in hindsight, was hollow? A song, a film, a message that thrilled your feelings but left your thoughts untouched? That's the veil. That's how it sings. But Nietzsche wasn't content to just pull it back. He wanted to tear it down. Because if beauty could lie, then truth had to become fierce. Clarity had to become confrontation. And art, real art, had to do more than please. It had to provoke. If you think this lesson was unsettling, wait until you see what Nietzsche found next. That this wasn't just manipulation. It was medicine. Not the healing kind, but the kind that puts you to sleep before the end. Chapter 3. The Morphine Melody. Nietzsche once wrote, Wagner is not healthy, but he didn't mean it metaphorically. He meant it quite literally. He saw Wagner's music as a drug, a powerful, soothing narcotic designed not to awaken the soul, but to put it to sleep. Like morphine administered to a terminal patient, it dulled the pain and delayed the end. But it didn't cure, it didn't strengthen, it only made surrender feel sublime. This is the heart of Nietzsche's accusation. He believed that art, real art, should be a storm. It should tear through complacency, strip away illusions, confront you with raw life. But Wagner's music did the opposite. It made pain beautiful, suffering desirable, and weakness noble. It offered no clarity, only comfort, no challenge, only escape. It was a lullaby for a dying culture. Picture this, a concert hall filled with trembling listeners. The music swells. A tragic hero collapses on stage. The crowd erupts in tears, overwhelmed. But Nietzsche, sitting among them, sees something different. He sees a mass ritual of surrender, a people longing not to live more bravely, but to die more beautifully. That, to him, was the rot beneath the applause. Fast forward to 2025, and the morphine is stronger than ever. It's not just in opera halls, it's in your headphones, in your feeds. Music that floods you with feeling, but leaves you hollow. Algorithms that sedate rather than stimulate. Art that floods your body with dopamine, but leaves your willpower untouched. A culture that overdoses on emotion, but starves for meaning. Nietzsche would call it sonic sentimentality. Sounds that bypass the intellect and go straight for the nerves. And while it feels deep, it's as shallow as a screen swipe. Because true depth doesn't just make you feel, it makes you see. Think about it. Have you ever played a song on repeat, not because it inspired you, but because it numbed you? Because it made your heartbreak feel poetic? Because it let you wallow in pain without demanding change? That's not healing. That's morphine. And the more we consume it, the more we confuse comfort with truth. But Nietzsche believed we needed pain. Not the theatrical kind, but the real kind. The kind that breaks illusions. The kind that demands we rise, not retreat. To him, art should be like fire, not a feather. It should scar the lies off your skin. And this leads to his most daring claim yet. That Wagner wasn't just a composer. He was a priest. And the concert hall wasn't a theater. It was a church. Not one of light and redemption, but of suffering, ritualized and repeated. So what happens when the melody becomes a sermon, when feeling becomes faith, when beauty baptizes weakness? You're about to enter Nietzsche's most controversial revelation, the sacred core of Wagner's deception, a gospel in disguise. Chapter 4, The Messiah in Mask and Melody. Nietzsche wasn't just accusing Wagner of being sentimental, he was accusing him of being religious. Beneath the velvet curtain and golden crescendos, Nietzsche saw something disturbingly familiar. Guilt, redemption, suffering as glory, wrapped not in scripture, but in song. Look closely at Wagner's characters, the noble sacrifice, the repentant sinner, the weeping savior. These weren't mythic heroes, they were Christ figures on stage. Suffering wasn't a tragedy, it was a virtue. Pain wasn't to be transcended, it was to be romanticized. And Nietzsche, who had long since declared God is dead, watched in horror as Wagner resurrected him, in operatic form. This wasn't religion of structure and dogma, it was religion of emotion. And it worked. The crowd cried not because they understood, but because they were moved. And for Nietzsche, that was the problem. Feeling became the new faith. Redemption was no longer a doctrine, it was a soundtrack. He called it the Church of Wagner, a place where weakness was worshipped, where the more you suffered, the holier you became. It mirrored Christianity, but stripped of its theology. Only the emotional mechanics remained. To Nietzsche, this was spiritual manipulation. Art wasn't elevating humanity. It was seducing it back into chains, one aria at a time. And isn't that still happening? We no longer gather in cathedrals to chant hymns. We gather in stadiums to cry, to break up songs. We watch stories where the protagonist's collapse is painted as beauty, where confession is confused with courage, where suffering is sacred but growth is optional. Nietzsche saw it first in Wagner, but he warned it would spread. Art as a new kind of gospel, one without truth, only trembling. And he feared it because he knew how powerful it was, because he had once believed in it himself. Imagine standing before a great stage, the lights dim. A single figure steps forward, not a hero, but a martyr. He sings of guilt, of sacrifice, of the pain he must endure for others. And the music swells, and you are overwhelmed. You weep. You rise to applaud. But Nietzsche, sitting in the shadows, asks a different question. Why do you cheer for suffering? Have you ever caught yourself drawn to stories of loss, of ruin, of pain paraded as poetry? Have you noticed how the world rewards victimhood with applause, with sympathy, with status? That's what Nietzsche feared most. That art no longer called us to overcome, but to dissolve. But he wasn't done exposing, because behind this spiritual seduction was something even more dangerous. A mass movement. A new religion not of belief, but of feeling, and it was spreading faster than any creed. Chapter 5, The Church of Feelings. Wagner did not build an opera house, he built a cathedral, and in Nietzsche's eyes, the audience were not listeners, they were worshippers. They gathered not to think, but to feel. They didn't seek truth, they sought transcendence through tears. Wagner had created more than art, he had created ritual, emotional ecstasy dressed in strings and silence. And Nietzsche, once a devout believer in that ritual, now saw it for what it was, a cult of comfort. To him, this was the final evolution of decadence, not political, not moral, but emotional. We were no longer seeking clarity, we were addicted to catharsis. We didn't want to confront reality, we wanted to feel deeply while avoiding the cost of growth. Wagner delivered that perfectly. The soaring music, the noble collapse, the sacred victim, all of it fed a hunger Nietzsche believed was dangerous, the hunger to feel instead of becoming. He saw the masses weeping in unison, nodding as one, their identities dissolved in emotional haze. No questions, no resistance, just communion. This was not art, he said. It was anesthetic worship, and Wagner was its high priest. Now pause. Ask yourself, how different is that from today? We binge-watch shows not to learn, but to drown. We fall in love with songs that validate our sorrow, not to heal, but to sit in it. We seek art not to break illusions, but to be bathed in them. The more emotional, the more holy it feels. Nietzsche warned of this emotional collectivism, a church where feeling becomes truth, and truth becomes irrelevant. But it doesn't end with music. It's in the TED Talks that sell inspiration without challenge, in the Instagram quotes that preach healing without transformation, in the TikTok videos where pain becomes a trend and trauma a badge. It's not belief that unites us now. It's sentiment, shared emotion masquerading as insight, and Nietzsche saw the cost. Because once we raise feelings to the altar, we lower everything else. Reason, strength, self-overcoming, they all bow before the emotional crescendo, and in that moment, the individual dissolves. We stop becoming, we start consuming. But Nietzsche didn't write the Case of Wagner to condemn music. He wrote it to ask a brutal question. Are we still capable of art that awakens? Or are we only chasing the next emotional high? Have you ever been part of a crowd swept up in collective feeling? A concert, a film, a cause, only to realize afterward that nothing changed? You felt everything, and did nothing. That is the church of feelings. That is what Nietzsche feared, the erosion of becoming, hidden beneath the flood of feeling. But there was still hope, because if Wagner was the priest of surrender, there had to be an artist of sunlight. If music could infect, then perhaps it could also heal. Nietzsche found that sound, not in the north, but in the south, not in Germany, but in Spain. Chapter 6, The Sugar That Rots. To understand decadence, Nietzsche said, you must forget what you think you know. It's not about filth or darkness. It's not about ugliness. Decadence is sweetness, excessive, unearned, manipulative sweetness. Like sugar laced into every note of a song, every frame of a film, every word of a sermon. It pleases you while it poisons you. It makes you feel good as it hollows you out. And that's why it's so hard to see, because it tastes like beauty. Wagner's music to Nietzsche was the perfect example. On the surface, it was grand, romantic, overwhelming. But beneath that surface, it was soft, weak. It lacked clarity. It lacked form. It dissolved the will in favor of waves of emotion. It fed the ear, but starved the spirit. It was a sonic dessert, rich, indulgent, but devoid of nourishment. Nietzsche called it musical diabetes. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion. And he saw this aesthetic pattern spreading, not just in opera, but in language, in politics, in culture. Everywhere you looked, there was more frosting, less substance, more drama, less direction. People didn't want challenge, they wanted flavor. And now, in 2025, the sugar is everywhere. Pop songs engineered to hit emotional triggers. Social media feeds filled with curated sadness and artificial intimacy. Movies that look like epics, but end in meaninglessness. Influencers selling empowerment in pastel fonts while drowning in curated fragility. The algorithm doesn't care if you grow. It cares if you stay. And nothing makes you stay like sweetness. And Nietzsche would ask, what are we consuming? And what is it doing to our strength? Have you noticed how easy it is now to feel overwhelmed by a song you'll forget tomorrow? Or how certain movies make you cry, but never change? That's not resonance, that's sugar. Art designed to make you feel, not think, to numb, not nourish. But here's what makes it dangerous. Once you've adapted to sugar, truth tastes bitter. Once you've grown used to aesthetic ease, discipline feels cruel. Once your mind is flooded with saccharine stimulation, clarity feels like silence. And that, Nietzsche warned, is when a culture begins to rot. Because sweetness is addictive, and the addiction doesn't announce itself. It masquerades as inspiration, as comfort, as meaning. But it replaces the real thing. You begin to crave more, but grow less. That's the paradox of artistic sugar. The more you consume, the emptier you become. But Nietzsche wasn't interested in nostalgia or despair. He believed in antidotes, in fire that purifies, in sunlight that burns off fog. And he found that not in the North, not in Wagner, but in the South, in the music of Bizet. If Wagner was morphine, Bizet was caffeine, clear, sharp, awakening. And it came not from sorrow, but from sunlight. Chapter 7, The Sound of Health. When Nietzsche discovered Bizet's Carmen, it wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a revelation. Here was music that didn't seduce through suffering, didn't drown the listener in tears or guilt. Instead, it moved like sunlight over stone, clear, strong, unapologetically alive. It had rhythm, restraint, fire, and above all, it had health. Where Wagner's operas wrapped you in fog, Bizet's work cut through it. It didn't numb the pain, it awakened the pulse. In Carmen, Nietzsche saw what art was supposed to do. Sharpen the senses, not drown them. There was passion, but not pity. Desire, but not drama. Even in tragedy, there was no sanctification of suffering. Carmen dies, yes, but not as a saint. She defies, she chooses, she burns. This, Nietzsche believed, was what art could be when it wasn't infected, when it was built not to comfort, but to confront. He praised the Mediterranean flavor of Bizet's music, the warmth, the sensuality, the discipline. It was not the bloated indulgence of the North, it was the precision of the South. Every note served the story, every moment held its shape. There was no collapse into emotion for emotion's sake, and in that, Nietzsche saw a kind of musical morality, not preachy, but pure. He called it the return of clarity, and he meant that in the deepest sense. Clarity not just of sound, but of soul. Art that helped you see sharper, stand straighter, feel deeper, without collapsing. Bizet's music didn't glorify wounds, it glorified will. It was life-affirming, not life-escaping. And you, when was the last time you encountered a piece of art that didn't ask you to cry, but asked you to wake up? Not one that pandered to your wounds, but one that invited you to walk forward anyway. That's the difference Nietzsche was pointing at. One is indulgence. The other is growth. He imagined a future where art would no longer serve the weakening of mankind, but its resurrection. Not art that wraps you in sorrow, but art that slices through illusion. And he knew the path would not be through sentiment, but through structure, not an emotional release, but an aesthetic strength. In many ways, Carmen was Nietzsche's rebellion. It was his musical manifesto, a declaration that art could be beautiful and brutal, emotional and exact, that the two were not enemies, but necessary partners. And in lifting up Bizet, he was laying down a blueprint, a return to form, fire, and formidability. But this raises the ultimate challenge. If Wagner is everywhere and Bizet is rare, then what kind of art do we choose? What kind of music do we follow? What kind of beauty do we allow into our minds? Because the final chapter in Nietzsche's case was not about Wagner or Bizet, it was about us. Chapter 8. The Art That Chooses Life. Nietzsche never wrote to entertain. He wrote to wake the dead. And the case of Wagner wasn't just a breakup letter. It was a warning flare. He wasn't merely attacking one composer. He was diagnosing a pattern, a disease of culture, a spiritual flu that numbed the will and worshipped the wound. And behind every beautiful melody, he heard the quiet drumbeat of decay. But he didn't stop there. He asked a question most never dare to ask. What kind of art do you allow to shape your soul? Because to Nietzsche, every brushstroke, every bar of music, every cinematic note was not neutral. It was directional. Art didn't just reflect culture, it led it. It trained emotions, it sculpted values, it whispered what we should cry over and what we should never confront. And in this war between beauty and truth, Nietzsche drew a sharp line. There is art that anesthetizes and art that awakens, art that sings you to sleep and art that shocks you into living, and you must choose. Because the art you consume is the future you create. He spoke of the yes-sayers and the no-sayers. The no-sayers collapse into pain and call it virtue. The yes-sayers face life's darkness and still choose to dance. He wasn't calling for coldness. He was calling for courage, for art that made you feel deeper without losing your edge, for melodies that stirred action, not martyrdom. In 2025, that choice has only grown louder. We scroll through curated pain. We binge fictional trauma. We applaud the aesthetics of sadness and retweet despair. But rarely do we ask, does this art make me stronger or just more addicted to feeling weak? That's Nietzsche's legacy. Not just philosophy, but a mirror, a confrontation, a dare. He invites us to become curators of our souls, to ask of every song, every film, every post, is this building me or breaking me beautifully? So ask yourself now, honestly, what art rules your inner cathedral? Who are your Wagners? Who are your Bizets? What soundtracks are shaping your silence? Because the next time you feel something deeply, pause. Before you call it art, ask, did it wake me up or just let me sleep more sweetly? This is the line Nietzsche drew in the sand, between art that embalms and art that electrifies. And if you've come this far, perhaps you already feel it, the quiet craving for clarity, the subtle hunger to be sharpened, not just soothed. Because the most radical act in a world of beautiful infection is to choose something healthy, and that is the art that chooses life. Call to action. Wake up from the beautiful infection. If you've made it to this point, then you're not just watching, you're awakening. You've journeyed with Nietzsche from blind devotion to brutal clarity. You've stood at the altar of Wagner's seductive melodies and seen the infection hiding in their sweetness. You've felt the fog of emotional anesthesia and glimpsed the sunlight of a stronger sound. So now the question turns to you. What kind of beauty do you worship? You've just absorbed 8 chapters of uncomfortable truth. You learned how even geniuses can become false gods. You saw how emotional highs can hollow the soul. You uncovered the church of feelings and how easily we kneel. You tasted the sugar that rots. You felt the fire in Bizet's precision. And now you stand at a crossroads. The art you consume becomes the architecture of your inner world. So, choose well. Choose music that burns illusion. Choose stories that sharpen will. Choose beauty that demands you rise, not dissolve. And if this video stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Comment below, art should, ça sko. Fill it in, start a movement. Because when we demand more from art, we become more as people. And remember, the most dangerous virus doesn't scream, it sings. Let's stop clapping for the rot. Let's start listening for the flame.